Hello everybody, I'm Michael Feinstein with Conversations and Music. Here in this archive room we are surrounded by all sorts of recordings in many different formats. There are a lot of LPs, which are vinyl records, 33 and a third RPM, which is the speed of the records. And there are 45 RPM records, and then there are 78 RPM records. I'm going to focus on a few Broadway-related recordings today, and I've just pulled sort of helter-skelter some things that might be of interest. One of the things that I find intriguing is that people now often refer to a recording of a Broadway show as a soundtrack. That is not correct. I know most people say, oh, I'm going to get the soundtrack of Hamilton or whatever, but there is no soundtrack of Hamilton because soundtrack specifically relates to a movie. And maybe if I explain a little further, you'll understand why that is an incorrect term, even though I know it's popular usage, but it's just plain wrong. And that's because a soundtrack recording, which may be an LP or maybe a CD or whatever form the final form is, it means that it comes literally from the track of sound that accompanies a strip of movie film. That's why it is called a soundtrack. That is a technical term, a literal description of what a soundtrack is. So a Broadway show cannot have a soundtrack if it is performed on Broadway. The only thing that can have a soundtrack is something that is actually tracked on film. And this is what a soundtrack looks like. This is a strip of film, and if you look on the left, you will see to the left of the image two lines or three lines, two white and one black, or if you look at the edge, there's another line. That is the soundtrack accompanying the image that is in the frames to the right of the soundtrack. And this is an optical soundtrack, which means that it is read by a reader in the projector that reproduces the soundtrack. There are also magnetic soundtracks, which were evolved in the 1950s, and then they started stereophonic soundtracks and such. But the standard soundtrack for a film was on optical film until they started using magnetic tracks in the 1950s. But this is a soundtrack. So there are often recordings of scores. If they were on Broadway and also made into motion pictures, there is an original Broadway cast recording. Then there is also a soundtrack recording. So when I was growing up, there were often two main choices for a show. If it's The Sound of Music, there was the cast album with Mary Martin, and then there was the soundtrack recording with Julie Andrews. Then there were all these copycat albums that were made. There were dozens and dozens of albums that were made with selections from any hit musical, like The Sound of Music. There were 101 strings, and there were instrumental brass recordings. I mean, you name it. And they also did cast recordings that were not Broadway casts, but they would assemble a cast just for the purpose of making a record of something like Flower Drum Song. And often these were sold in department stores or drug stores for like 49 cents, 89 cents. They were very inexpensive compared to what you would have to pay for an original cast album. And sometimes they would try and make the covers look as much as they could like the original Broadway cast album to fool people into buying them. This one is not trying to fool anybody. It says featuring the voices of these performers, many of whom were actually Broadway performers, but they weren't in the cast of Flower Drum Song. So this is an example of what we call a cover recording. Maybe I should take it out of the plastic so you can see it a little better. It's a very nice decorative cover. So there's that. So this is an original cast album. This is the original cast album, so on a clear day you can see forever. It's autographed to me from Burton Lane, with whom I worked. And they did these very handsomely. They often were gatefold albums like this that told the story of the show with pictures, and sometimes they would have souvenir booklets that accompanied them, the same ones that you could buy in the theaters. Burton signed that one to me too. So this one was actually prepared for the cast recording and is a flimsy version of the same souvenir program that was sold in the theater. So that's kind of fun to see that. There's Burton Lane, who wrote the music, and Alan J. Lerner, who wrote the lyrics. So this is the cast album of, the Broadway cast album of On a Clear Day You Can See Forever. This is an advance copy of the soundtrack of the movie that was made with Barbra Streisand, that was released, in 1970? So this is a soundtrack recording. It's taken from the soundtrack of the film. And this was a promotional LP that was issued before the movie came out. And because it was issued so early, it was before they had finalized the choices of musical numbers that were going to be in the film. And so there's several things on this soundtrack album that are different from the commercially issued soundtrack. For one thing, it has two songs that were completely cut out of the film. Who Is There Among Us Who Knows, which was sung in the movie by Jack Nicholson. And they mercifully cut that. And the other thing that they cut was the song Wait Till We're 65, which was sung by Ms. Streisand and Larry Blyden, who otherwise does not have a musical number in the film. And then they cut a reprise of Yves Montand singing She Isn't You. They changed the main title. They changed a whole bunch of these numbers. So this is very, very rare and very collectible, particularly, of course, for Streisand fans. So that gives you an illustration of the difference between an original cast album and a soundtrack. And they often rush these out so quickly that they just had like these paste-on labels because they were not for commercial purposes, so they didn't care about making attractive graphics. Well, in addition to cast albums, there were often albums that were done of the scores of the shows that were sent for promotion before the shows even opened on Broadway or while they were out of town trying out. And these recordings of scores were made by studio singers who were hired just for that purpose, to exploit the score of a particular show. And often they would hire singers who would sound like Sinatra or would sound like Julie Andrews in order to try and get record companies to do cover recordings of these songs by their popular artists. And so there are all these advanced promotional albums of scores that are all sung by unidentified performers. Some of these were done by Barry Manilow, some of these were done by Neil Sedaka, some of these were done by singers, Melissa Manchester, performers who later became quite famous, but at that time were doing studio work. This is the advance recording of the score of It's a Funny Old World by Leslie Bricusse and Anthony Newley. This is the advance score album for Mac and Mabel, and this is unusual in that it is so beautifully done. It's such an attractive cover. And this album contains a song that was cut out of the show called Today I'm Gonna Think About Me. That never made it into the show. And sometimes these albums also have alternate lyrics or lyrics that were changed before the shows opened. And they were often accompanied by copies of the sheet music, again in hopes that whoever they sent these to would perform and record these songs. So I have a whole slew of these, and there's a whole community of people who collect these albums because they do have songs that were cut, so they're documents of these shows before they opened on Broadway, like the score of Raisin, which was the musical version of Raisin in the Sun, is a very nice presentation copy, and it has this little blurb here. Blackwood Music is proud to publish the score for Raisin, a new musical based on Lorraine Hansberry's A Raisin in the Sun. Raisin will open on Broadway October 18th, 1973 at the 46th Street Theater. The out-of-town reviews on the enclosed tear sheet from the New York Times are unanimous, indicating we have a hit show. As a result of these reviews, which will include Clive Barnes' rave, indications are clear that there will be at least a $1 million advance ticket sale by the time the show is in New York. So we've started our promotional campaign early. So they've even included in this record photos from the cast: Virginia Capers, Ernestine Jackson. So this is typical of what they did in the 1970s to try and exploit a forthcoming Broadway show. So that is Raising. I have a couple of Richard Rodgers advance. Now this one is the advance recording for Rex, the Richard Rodgers Sheldon Harnick show, and it lists Penny Fuller and the rest of the cast here. However, I believe that this is the demo recording. So even though this would lead you to believe that it is the Broadway cast performing this, it actually is unknown demo singers performing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 selections on this side and 4 selections on this side. And they often, in these demonstration recording not for public performance, which means that you couldn't play it on the airwaves or on radio, they often would do the antithesis of the Broadway presentations, that they would do these with pop beats and do them in a style that they thought would best give whoever was listening to it an idea of what it would sound like as a pop song. This is a rudimentary advance. Edwin H. Morris is the music publishing company, score from the Broadway show, The Selling of the President. Now this is, it is a press disc. Sometimes they are lacquers, which are individually grooved discs. And this has a note from someone who worked at Edwin H. Morris. It says, "Hurry, show coming into New York based on McGinnis' book, The Selling of the President." So this is somebody saying, hurry, get in quick and record the songs from this show because it's coming to New York and you'll want to be the first. I mean, how many of you have heard of a musical, The Selling of the President? This is Betty Compton, Adolph Green, and Julie Stein's score for Subways Are for Sleeping. And again, this has some things that were not in the final show. And Hal Linden, who was in this show, told me that one section of one of the numbers, I forget the lyric, went da 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 da. It was a musical theme that later went into the interlude of Don't Rain on My Parade. I'm gonna live and live now, but it was originally written for Subways Are for Sleeping. This is as we're getting into the rock and roll era. Galt McDermott. This is the publisher demo by Chapel for Two Gentlemen of Verona. This is how they presented it. This is another Stein, Comden, and Green score. This is Hallelujah Baby, which starred the incredible Leslie Uggams. Somebody crossed out this one, Talking to Yourself, and it says out of show. So the publisher probably crossed it out, saying don't exploit this song because it's not going to go anywhere. Often, in an attempt to get a recording out very quickly, the publishers would send out a test pressing before they had even done the graphics or any of the liner notes or anything. And this is an example of that. This is an advanced test pressing for the show Archie and the Hittable with Carol Channing. And they wanted to rush the album out for press, so this is what they sent out, just with a paste-on label that says Archie and Mehitabel and a master number. So there's nothing else connected to that. So those are demonstration recordings. Now, the word record album, that in itself is an antique or obsolete term at this point, but the reason that these are called cast albums or record albums is because they have a collection of different songs in them that were literally in a physical album. This is a 78 RPM set of selections from the show On the Town. And instead of being an individual record with one song on one side and another on the second, this is a collection of 1, 2, 3, 4 10-inch 78 records put into an album. That's why they're called record albums. This is a recording of, it says songs and ballet music from On the Town. And this is not an original cast recording. Back in the 1940s, it wasn't until the 1943 recording of Oklahoma on Decca Records that they started regularly creating original cast recordings of selections from shows. they usually did rudimentary recordings. For example, this 1940 Cole Porter show, Panama Hattie, only had 4 selections recorded by the star of the show, Ethel Merman. And so that's as close as they got to a cast album, 4 selections. And it's very nicely done. It should have a booklet in it, which I am missing, but this is all that we got for Panama Hattie, 4 songs. Mexican Hayride, which came later in the 40s, is an original cast recording. This is after Oklahoma, and Oklahoma was one of the huge sellers of the time. So then Decca was one of the major companies in recording cast albums, but they were always limited by the recording technology of the time. They were recording on 78 RPM records, and so they were limited in the amount of time they could put on the single side of the disc. And so they had to pick and choose how many selections they were going to record. Were they going to do an album that was 3 records, 6 sides, or 4 records, which would be 8 sides, or 5 records, which would be 10 sides. And sometimes they would put out one set of records, one album, and then if it sold extremely well, they would record more selections and put out a volume 2. Now this Decca record set for Mexican Hayride has the booklet that came with the original 78s, and it has a synopsis of the show. It lists these selections, and these little booklets are often harder to find than the record sets themselves, because people often took them out of the records or threw them away. So to be able to have this is a lot of fun. And it reproduces the lyrics of the songs, so one can follow along. And then it has a biography of Cole Porter. Mike Todd, who produced the show, later married Elizabeth Taylor. June Havoc, who was the star. And Baby June in Gypsy later was the inspiration. And then the inside jacket of the set has beautiful pictures that are very well reproduced. So this is the evolution of cast recordings here. This is another cast recording. This is Mary Martin in Lute Song, which was not a very successful show, unfortunately. And this is sort of bare bones. There's no illustrations inside, but the booklet is quite attractive. And this is the only Broadway musical in which Nancy Reagan appeared, the future First Lady, of course. Her name was Nancy Davis at that time. And she is, I don't know if she's on this cast recording, but she was in that show. This is a record set put out by RCA Victor to exploit the 1942 Broadway review, Irving Berlin's This Is the Army. It is not the original cast recording. This is the competition album that RCA Victor put out because they did not win the rights to record the cast album. Decca Records got that. So this is their competition album for that. And it features, amongst others, Fats Waller, who did a wonderful recording of one of the Berlin songs called That's What the Well-Dressed Men in Harlem Will Wear, a charming song. This is the original cast recording of a huge, huge Broadway hit, Finian's Rainbow, and this was a hugely successful recording, but this is the first issue on 78s from 1947, and this album did so well that it was immediately one of the first discs issued on LP records, 33s when they came out, and then of course on CD and remastered. So that's Finian's Rainbow. Now On the Town was on a 78 set, but there wasn't an actual cast recording that featured the entire score of On the Town until this LP was done in the 1970s, and they were able to reassemble several members of the original cast from the mid-1940s and do a stereo recording of On the Town many, many years after it was originally presented. This is the LP transfer of the On the Town cast album that was on 78s, and this is the LP transfer of Lute Song. Because there were only 6 selections of each, they split them up and put them on one LP record because they didn't have enough for either to make a full LP. This is a production disc from the soundtrack of the film of Oklahoma. This is Surrey with the Fringe on Top, and this record actually belonged to Richard Rodgers. So this is a non-commercial disc that was given to Richard Rodgers for the purposes of him auditioning it to make sure that he liked the performance, and therefore it's quite rare. 20th Century Fox released the film Oklahoma, but this has an MGM Studios label, and the reason for that is because they recorded the soundtrack score for Oklahoma at MGM Studios, and that's why it has an MGM Studios label, even though it was not an MGM production. So let's see what else we have here. The cast recordings in America are very spotty when you go back to the 1920s, because once in a while a recording company would ask a person who was appearing on Broadway to recreate their performance on a commercial recording. But for the most part, in the teens and 20s, record companies did not care about memorializing or preserving the original Broadway performances of practically anything. But there were occasional exceptions. And this is the first existing Gershwin original cast recording. This was recorded in 1920. It's from a show called The George White Scandals of 1920, and it's featured Lester O'Keefe. Lester O'Keefe sang this song on Broadway, Songs of Long Ago. So Lester O'Keefe goes down in history as being the first person to make an original cast recording of a Gershwin song. And it's a charming little song that is completely forgotten. Well, let's see. Okay, here's how we'll tie this all up. I talked about exploitation of scores for the purpose of trying to get people to record them commercially to make the songs hits. Well, in 1949, Columbia Records obtained the rights to release the cast album for the Irving Berlin show Miss Liberty, which was moderately successful. But before the show opened, they sent out, in a very novel bit of advertising, recordings of Irving Berlin himself performing selections from the score. Quite unusual, and this is the letter that accompanied the record they sent out. Dear Mr. Chapman, John Chapman was, it says NEW News, okay. Irving Berlin paid us a visit to Columbia Records a few weeks ago. The purpose of Mr. Berlin's visit was to discuss our recording of his Miss Liberty score with the original Broadway cast, as well as our releasing several tunes from his new show on single records. Specifically, Mr. Berlin was anxious to convey his impression of how the songs should be interpreted. Subscribing to the theory that actions speak louder than words, he had his own piano transported to our studios and cut several songs from the show. These records were circulated among our artists so they would know how Mr. Berlin wanted his songs done. It occurred to me that you might be interested in hearing how one of the great songwriters of our era sounded on records. Therefore, I have had pressings made of 2 of the tunes. These records will not be sold commercially and are not offered for review purposes. I am sending the attached record to you for your personal use. I think you'll agree that it is a real collector's item. Kindest regards, Walter Murphy. So, I think we should now listen to this recording of Irving Berlin. So, oh, I should show you the label of this thing. What's that? A little dark, but Special Columbia record, The Honorable Profession of the Fourth Estate, from Miss Liberty by Irving Berlin, vocal, Irving Berlin accompanying himself at the piano. So, let's see what this sounds like. Get that going. Get that going. Hope for the best.
Times and Herald, World and Sun, each admits the other one is great. The honorable profession of the fourth estate, a profession that we love and delighted to be members of. Out in Maine a dam has burst, though the herald gets there first, we wait. The honorable profession of the fourth estate, none of us would ever stoop to indulge in what we call a scoop, giving you the news as we do our stint, seeing that the news is well presented, all the news that's fit and unfit to print, all the facts as soon as they're invented. When you're laid out stiff and cold, who will meet you at the Golden Gate? The honorable profession of the fourth estate, and you must be free from sin, otherwise we just won't let you in. From the east to the west to the north, not the first nor the second nor the third, but the fourth estate.
Second chorus.
When the baby starts to bounce out of wedlock, who'll announce the date? The honorable profession of the fourth estate. We agreed to spread the word when stork becomes an early bird. When they raided Madam's flat, filled with husbands who was at the gate. The honorable profession of the fourth estate. When a married man lets go, we believe the public ought to know. Every now and then we send out some checks, paying off the folks who sue for libel. Saturday we give you murder and sex. Sunday we'll be quoting from the Bible. When elections have been planned, who can pick the winning candidate? The honorable profession of the fourth estate. And it's just as we predict, they elect the president we pick. From the east to the west to the north, not the first nor the second nor the third, but the fourth estate.
Thank you, Irving Berlin, and thanks to all of you. See you next time.